Apache warriors saved a white child from auction until he learned she carried his bloodline in 1882. An Apache warrior spent his last stolen gold to buy a white girl from an auction block. But when she whispered his sister's name in her sleep, he realized he hadn't saved a stranger's child. He had found a last piece of his murdered family. The sun beat down on Willow Creek like a fist, turning the dirt to dust and the dust to memory. Running Wolf pressed his back against the saloon's weathered boards, his dark eyes fixed on the wooden platform where men sold what should never be sold. The crowd gathered thick as flies around rotting meat, their voices rising and falling like buzzards over carrion. On the platform, a girl stood silent. She could not have been more than 12 summers old, though the hunger in her face made her seem older. Her dress hung loose on thin shoulders, once blue but now the color of old bruises. Her hair fell in tangles around a face too pale for this desert sun, but her eyes were black as midnight, black as Apache eyes, black as his own. Running Wolf's hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, feeling the weight of gold coins taken from a stagecoach 3 moons past. He had planned to trade them for ammunition, for supplies to keep his small band alive through another winter of hiding. Now he watched the girl and felt something stir in his chest, something he had buried beneath years of rage and loss. The auctioneer, a fat man with sweat stains spreading under his arms, called out numbers like a prayer to the white man's god of greed. "What my bid for this fine young worker?" "Strong hands, quick feet. She can cook, clean, tend to animals." "Start the bidding at $50. A rancher with cruel eyes and tobacco-stained teeth raised his hand. "50, 60, called another, a merchant whose smile made Running Wolf's skin crawl. The girl never moved. She stood straight as a pine, her chin up, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the crowd. But Running Wolf saw her hands tremble, saw the way she pressed her lips together to keep from crying out. In that moment, she looked like every Apache child who had ever faced the soldiers' guns with courage they should not have needed. 75. The rancher called again, and his laugh was like the sound of bones breaking. Running Wolf had seen enough. He pushed through the crowd, his moccasins silent on the dusty ground. Men stepped aside without looking, sensing something dangerous in his presence, even though they could not name it. He wore white man's clothes, stolen clothes, and kept his long hair tied back, but his eyes held the wildness of places these town people had never seen. $100. His voice cut through the chatter like a blade. Heads turned. The auctioneer's eyes went wide, then narrow as he took in Running Wolf's copper skin, his high cheekbones, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. "You got that kind of money, boy?" the fat man asked, his voice dripping with the poison of men who believed some lives mattered more than others. Running Wolf reached into his pouch and pulled out 5 golden eagles, letting them catch the sun's light as he held them high. The crowd went quiet. Gold spoke louder than hate, at least for now. $100, he repeated, his English careful and clear. He had learned the white man's tongue as he had learned to use their weapons, as tools of survival in a world that wanted him dead. The rancher spat in the dirt. $125. $150. The bidding went on like a dance with death. Each number was another coin, another piece of the future he had planned for his people. But every time Running Wolf looked at the girl, he saw something that made his heart beat like war drums. She had turned her head just enough to watch him, and in her eyes he saw not gratitude, but recognition, as if she knew him from dreams she could not remember. $200, Running Wolf said, and his voice carried the finality of winter wind. The rancher cursed and stepped back. The merchant shook his head. No one else spoke. $200 was more than most of these men saw in a year. The auctioneer's hammer fell like thunder. Sold to the... He paused, searching for words that would not get him killed in this crowd. Sold to the gentleman with the gold. Running Wolf walked to the platform and climbed the 3 steps that separated him from the girl. Up close, he could see the old bruises on her arms, the way she held herself like a bird with broken wings trying to remember how to fly. But her eyes, those eyes held depths he had seen before in the face of his sister bright morning, lost to cavalry sabers 15 winters past. He held out his hand. The girl stared at it for a long moment, then placed her small fingers in his palm. Her skin was rough from work, but warm, alive. "What's her name?" he asked softly, speaking English though Apache words pressed against his teeth. "Sarah," she whispered. Her voice was like wind through dry grass. "Sarah Coleman." He nodded and helped her down from the platform. The crowd was already turning away, disappointed that the day's entertainment had ended so quietly. The auctioneer counted his coins and wiped sweat from his forehead. The world went back to its business of forgetting. But Running Wolf could not forget the way the girl had looked at him, as if she saw not a stranger, but someone from a story she almost remembered. He had saved her, he told himself, because he was Apache, and Apache did not let children suffer when they had the power to stop it. He had saved her because the white world had taken enough, and he would take something back. He had not saved her because her eyes reminded him of faces around campfires that would never burn again. He had not saved her because something in his blood sang when he looked at her, sang with a song he thought had died with the last of his family. They walked away from Willow Creek together, the Apache warrior and the white girl, leaving tracks in the dust that the wind would soon erase. Behind them, the town settled back into its daily rhythm of small cruelties and smaller mercies. Ahead lay the desert, vast and unforgiving and full of truths that neither of them was ready to face. But as they walked, Sarah began to hum a tune under her breath, a tune that made Running Wolf's blood turn cold and his heart beat like thunder, because it was an Apache lullaby that his sister used to sing. 3 days into the desert, Sarah began to change. Running Wolf had chosen their path carefully, avoiding the roads where cavalry patrols hunted men like him and the waterholes where bounty hunters waited like patient spiders. They traveled by night when the desert air turned cool and forgiving, and rested by day in whatever shade they could find: the shadow of a red rock wall, the sparse cover of a mesquite tree, the blessed darkness of an abandoned mine shaft. The girl followed without complaint. She ate the dried meat he shared and drank sparingly from his water skin. When her feet began to bleed through her thin shoes, she wrapped them in strips torn from her dress and kept walking. But it was in the quiet hours of rest that Running Wolf began to see things that made his blood run strange. On the second day, as she slept curled against a sun-warmed boulder, she spoke words that were not English. "Shabiji," she whispered, her voice soft as wind through sage. "Shabiji Haguni." Running Wolf's hand stilled on a knife he had been sharpening. Those were Apache words, words a white child should not know. "My little one, come here." Words his mother used to call to him and his sister when the evening fires were lit and the day's work was done. He watched Sarah's sleeping face, looking for some sign of deception, some hint that she was playing a game beyond her years. But her features were slack with true sleep, her breathing deep and even. Whatever dreams moved behind her closed eyelids, they came from a place deeper than conscious thought. When she woke, she spoke only English. She asked for water and thanked him with the careful politeness of a child taught to mind her manners. But her eyes held shadows that had not been there before, as if her dreams had opened doors in her mind that daylight could not quite close. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky the color of old blood, Sarah picked up a stick and began to draw in the sand. Running Wolf pretended to tend their small fire, but he watched her from the corner of his eye. Her movements were sure and swift, as if her hands remembered patterns her mind had never learned. First she drew a circle with 4 lines, extending from it like the legs of a spider. Then a series of zigzag marks that looked like lightning or like the path water takes down a mountainside. Finally, she drew something that made Running Wolf's breath catch in his throat, a symbol that looked like a bird with outstretched wings, but with small marks around it that he recognized as the Apache sign for protection. When she finished, Sarah stared at her drawing for a long moment, her brow furrowed, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle written in a language she almost understood. Then she brushed the sand smooth with her palm, erasing the symbols as if they had never been. "Why did you draw those?" Running Wolf asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah looked up at him, and for a moment her eyes held the startled look of someone waking from a dream. I don't know, she said. My fingers just wanted to. That night, Running Wolf did not sleep. He sat with his back against a rock and watched the girl as she lay wrapped in his spare blanket, her face peaceful in the starlight. Twice more she spoke in Apache, single words, fragments of sentences that drifted up from whatever deep place her dreams explored. Once she said, Shimisani, the word for grandmother. Another time she whispered, Ch-osh, which meant bug, but the way she said it was fond, the way a child might speak of a pet. Most disturbing of all, as dawn approached and her sleep grew lighter, she began to whisper a name. Ayana, she breathed, so softly he almost missed it. Ayana, where are you? Running Wolf's heart clenched like a fist. Ayana meant eternal blossom in the old language. It was not a common name among his people, but it was a name he knew. It was the name his sister had chosen for the daughter she planned to have someday, back when she was young and the world was full of possibilities instead of soldiers. When Sarah woke with the sunrise, Running Wolf was ready with questions. He asked them carefully, gently, the way a man might approach a wild animal he did not want to frighten. Tell me about your dreams, he said as they shared the last of their water. Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she would not answer. Then she said, I dream of a woman with long black hair. She sings to me in a language I don't understand, but somehow I know what the words mean. She calls me something that isn't Sarah. What does she call you? It sounds like Ayana, but that's not my name. My name is Sarah Coleman. That's what Pa always told me. Running Wolf felt the world tilt beneath him like sand, giving way under a horse's hooves. Tell me about your Pa, tell me about the beginning, before you can remember clearly. So Sarah told him. She spoke of dim memories of a man who was not her father, but who raised her as his own. Thomas Coleman had been a good man, she said, a farmer who had found her as a baby after what he called Indian trouble near the Gila River. He had never told her exactly how he had found her, only that her real parents were dead and that she was blessed to have survived. He used to say I was lucky to be alive, Sarah said, her voice small. He said most babies don't make it when the Indians attack. But sometimes I wonder if he was telling me the whole truth. What makes you wonder that? Sarah was quiet again, drawing patterns in the sand with her finger. Not the symbols from before, but simple spirals that seemed to calm her. Sometimes Pa would look at me strange, especially when I was little and did things that reminded him of them. Like the time I made a doll out of corn husks the way no white child should know how. Or when I sang songs I'd never heard before. He always got real quiet when I did things like that. Where is Thomas Coleman now? Died of fever last winter. That's when the debts came due. That's why. She gestured vaguely back toward the town where Running Wolf had bought her freedom. That's why I was on that platform. Running Wolf nodded slowly. The pieces of the story were beginning to fit together like bones in a skeleton, forming the shape of a truth that made his heart race and his hands shake. He thought of his sister Bright Morning, who had been 17 when the cavalry came. He thought of how she had fought like a wildcat when they tried to take her, how she had screamed his name as they dragged her away. He had searched for her for months after, following every rumor, checking every fort and every settlement where captive Apache women might be held. He had never found her. The soldiers said she had died trying to escape, but her body was never recovered. After a year of searching, Running Wolf had finally accepted that his sister was gone, that the wind had carried her spirit to the place where all Apache spirits eventually return. But what if she had not died? What if she had escaped, only to be captured again by different men? Not soldiers this time, but settlers who saw a pregnant Apache woman as a problem to be solved quietly. What if she had given birth in captivity and died, giving life to a daughter she would never see grow up? What if that daughter was sitting beside him now, drawing symbols in the sand that her Apache blood remembered even when her mind did not? Running Wolf looked at Sarah, really looked at her, studying her face in the growing light of dawn. Beneath the pale skin that came from years of living indoors, beneath the hunger that had sharpened her features, he could see the ghost of his sister's face. The same deep eyes. The same stubborn set to her jaw. The same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. "Sarah," he said softly, "do you remember anything else from before Thomas Coleman? Any other dreams? Any other memories?" She shook her head, but something in her eyes suggested otherwise. Pa said it was better not to remember. He said some things are too sad to think about. Running Wolf reached out slowly and touched the girl's hand. Her fingers were long and graceful, like bright mornings had been, like his mother's had been, like the hands of women who had woven baskets and told stories and sung lullabies in a language that was dying with each passing season. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the things we try hardest to forget are the things our hearts need most to remember." Sarah looked at him with those dark eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom, and he saw something flicker there, recognition, perhaps, or hope, or fear of both. The desert wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of sage and the memory of rain that might never come, and Running Wolf wondered if the spirits of the dead could speak through the dreams of the living, calling their children home across the vast spaces that separated the world of the Apache from the world of the whites. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled against the endless sky, and Running Wolf found himself thinking of signs and symbols, of blood that called to blood across the years, and of the terrible possibility that he had not saved a stranger's child at all, but the last living piece of the family he thought he had lost forever. The abandoned camp lay in a fold between two red mesas, hidden from the world like a secret the desert kept close to its heart. Running Wolf had not been here in 3 years, not since he had come to bury the bones of the last Apache who remembered this place. But something had called him back, some pull in his blood that grew stronger as Sarah's dreams grew clearer. They arrived at midday when the sun stood straight overhead and shadows huddled close to the rocks like frightened children. The camp was smaller than Running Wolf remembered, just a handful of stone circles where fires had once burned and a few collapsed wickiups whose wooden frames pointed at the sky like the ribs of some great beast. Sarah stood at the edge of the ruins and went perfectly still. "What is this place?" she whispered, but her voice carried the weight of someone who already knew the answer. "It was home," Running Wolf said simply. "Long ago, before the soldiers came." He watched Sarah's face as she walked among the stone circles, her feet finding paths that had been worn smooth by generations of his people. She moved like someone walking through a dream, her hands trailing over rocks that still held the warmth of fires that would never burn again. At the largest fire circle, she stopped and knelt. Her fingers traced the blackened stones, and Running Wolf saw tears begin to track down her cheeks, though she made no sound of crying. "I know this place," she said, her voice breaking like a dry branch. "I've dreamed of it. I've dreamed of sitting by this fire, listening to stories told in that other language. There was a woman here, a woman with kind eyes who used to braid flowers in my hair." Running Wolf's throat closed tight. He remembered Bright Morning doing exactly that, weaving desert marigolds and tiny white flowers into the hair of the children, making them laugh with stories of coyote and raven and the old days when the world was young. "Tell me about the woman," he said, though part of him feared what Sarah might say. She had long black hair and wore a dress with beads sewn in patterns like lightning. She smelled like sage and would smoke. She used to sing to me while she worked, songs that made me feel safe even when I was scared. Sarah looked up at Running Wolf with eyes that held the depth of ancient springs. "She called me Ayana. She said it meant I would live forever, like the flowers that come back every spring." Running Wolf closed his eyes and felt the world shift beneath him like sand in a windstorm. Bright Morning had planned to name her daughter Ayana. She had told him so the night before the soldiers came, her hand resting on her belly where new life grew. "There's more," Sarah continued, rising to her feet. "In my dreams, I see soldiers coming. I see fire and smoke and people running. I see the woman, my mother, hiding me in a hollow log by the creek. She kissed my forehead and told me to be quiet, no matter what happened. She said someone would come for me, but no one did. No. When I finally crawled out, everything was quiet. The woman was gone. Everyone was gone. I was alone until the white man found me. Sarah wandered deeper into the ruins, drawn by something she could not name. Running Wolf followed, his heart beating like a war drum in his chest. Near the back of the camp, where the women had once worked their crafts in the shade of a great cottonwood, she stopped before a pile of stones that marked an old storage pit. Without hesitation, she began to move the stones. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "I don't know," she said, but her hands worked with the certainty of long practice. "Something is calling me. Something is here." Stone by stone, she cleared away the covering until the pit lay open like a dark mouth. Inside, wrapped in rotting deerskin, were the things his people had hidden before they fled, precious things they had hoped to return for someday. Sarah reached into the pit and pulled out a bundle. When she unwrapped it, Running Wolf's legs nearly gave way beneath him. It was a necklace of turquoise and silver beads, worked in a pattern that told the story of summer rain. He knew those beads. He had watched his grandmother string them, had seen his mother wear them on feast days, had helped Bright Morning repair a broken strand just weeks before she was taken. "This belonged to her," Sarah said, holding the necklace up to catch the light. "This belonged to the woman in my dreams." Running Wolf could not speak. The necklace hung between Sarah's fingers like a bridge between worlds, connecting the Apache girl she had been to the white child she had become. He remembered the day Bright Morning had hidden it here, along with the other precious things she could not bear to lose. "How do you know where to find it?" he finally managed to ask. Sarah fastened the necklace around her throat with hands that shook like leaves in a storm wind. The turquoise lay against her pale skin like drops of summer sky, and suddenly Running Wolf could see his sister in her face so clearly it took his breath away. "She told me," Sarah said simply, "in dreams. She showed me where the blue stones were sleeping, waiting for me to come home." The truth hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and impossible to deny. Running Wolf looked at this girl, his sister's daughter, his own blood, the last living piece of a family he had mourned as dead, and felt his world remake itself around her presence. "Her name was Bright Morning," he said, his voice rough as desert wind. "She was my sister. She was your mother." Sarah's knees gave way, and she sank to the ground beside the open pit. The necklace caught the light as she breathed, the beads rising and falling like a small ocean at her throat. "Then you are," she began, "your uncle, your family, your people." They sat in the ruins of the old camp as the sun moved across the sky, and Running Wolf told Sarah the story of her people, their people. He spoke of Bright Morning's laughter and her stubborn streak, and the way she could gentle the wildest horse with just her voice. He told her about their mother, who had died of the white man's spotted sickness, and their father, who had been killed defending the camp where Sarah now sat. He told her about the night the soldiers came, and how Bright Morning had fought like a she-wolf to protect the people she loved. How she had been taken but had somehow escaped, only to disappear into the vast emptiness of the desert. How he had searched for her until hope died in his chest like a fire in the rain. "She lived long enough to give you life," he said, "long enough to love you and name you and teach you the songs that still live in your dreams. She died protecting you, but part of her lives on in your blood." Sarah touched the necklace at her throat and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Running Wolf saw something new there. Not just recognition, but belonging. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know how to be Apache. I don't know the ways, the language, the customs. I've lived as a white girl for 12 years. You know more than you think," Running Wolf said gently. "Blood remembers what the mind forgets. The songs are still in you. The stories are still in you. You are still Iona, eternal blossom, even if you're also Sarah." Sarah looked around the abandoned camp, at the stone circles and broken dreams, at the endless desert that stretched beyond the red mesas toward horizons that held no promises. "But there is no place for Apache people anymore," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a truth that broke Running Wolf's heart. The old ways are dying. The soldiers have won. Running Wolf had no answer for that, because she was right. The world that had made him, that had shaped Bright Morning and their parents and all the generations before them, was disappearing like morning dew. Soon there would be nothing left but stories told in whispers and graves that no one remembered to visit. But looking at Sarah, at Ayana, with his sister's necklace at her throat and his people's blood in her veins, Running Wolf wondered if endings were not always the same as death, and if sometimes the best way to honor what was lost was to plant seeds of it in new ground, where it might grow in ways no one could. They spent 3 days in the ruins of the old camp, and in those 3 days, Running Wolf tried to give Sarah a lifetime of what she had lost. He taught her the names of things in Apache, Se for stone, To for water, Jati for antelope. He showed her how to read the desert's moods and the way the wind moved through the sage, how to find water by watching where the birds flew at dawn. He told her the old stories, the ones about changing woman and child of the water, about how the world was made and why the coyote sings. Sarah listened with the hunger of someone who had been starving without knowing what food looked like. She repeated the words until her tongue learned their shape, drew the symbols in the sand until her fingers remembered their meaning. But with each lesson, Running Wolf saw the weight of knowledge settling on her shoulders like a burden too heavy for someone so young to carry. On the third night, as they sat by a small fire built in the stone circle where his grandmother had once cooked, Sarah asked the question he had been dreading. What happens to me now? Running Wolf had been asking himself the same thing since the moment she had pulled Bright Morning's necklace from the earth. In his heart, he wanted to take her deeper into the desert, to the hidden places where a handful of Apache still lived free. He wanted to teach her everything: how to weave baskets from willow shoots, how to make acorn meal, how to sing the morning songs that welcomed each new day. But he also knew what such a life would mean for her. She would be an Apache girl in a world that had no place for Apache children. She would grow up hungry and hunted, always looking over her shoulder for soldiers or bounty hunters. She would learn to be strong, yes, but she would also learn to be afraid, and that was a terrible thing to pass on to someone whose childhood had already been stolen once. I don't know, he said honestly. The world has changed since I was your age. The old paths are closing one by one. Sarah poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up toward the stars. She wore Bright Morning's necklace always now, and the firelight made the turquoise beads glow like captured pieces of sky. Thomas Coleman used to say I had to choose, she said quietly. He said I couldn't be both things, Indian and white. He said I had to pick one and stick with it, or I'd never belong anywhere. What do you think? Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that surprised him. I think Thomas Coleman was wrong. I think maybe the problem isn't trying to be both things. Maybe the problem is thinking you have to choose. She looked across the fire at Running Wolf, and in her eyes he saw something that reminded him not of his sister, but of his grandmother, a deep wisdom that came from understanding that some battles were won not by fighting, but by refusing to accept that there had to be a battle at all. I want to learn everything you can teach me, Sarah continued. I want to know the stories and the songs and the old ways. But I also want to live. I want to have a chance to grow up and maybe have children of my own someday. And I think the only way I can do that is if I learn to walk between both worlds instead of trying to choose just one. Running Wolf felt something break open in his chest, not with sadness, but with a kind of fierce pride. This girl, this child who carried his sister's blood and his people's spirit, had found a wisdom that had taken him years of fighting to understand. It won't be easy, he warned her. White people will see your dark hair and wonder about your blood. Apache people, what few are left, might say you're not truly one of us because you were raised white. You might spend your whole life feeling like you don't quite belong in either world. Maybe, Sarah said, but maybe belonging isn't about fitting perfectly into one place. Maybe it's about carrying pieces of all the places you've been and all the people you've loved. She touched the necklace at her throat, and Running Wolf knew she was thinking of Bright Morning, of Thomas Coleman, who had raised her with kindness, if not understanding, of the Apache ancestors whose stories were now part of her blood. "I have an idea," she said. "What if I go back to the white world, but not as Sarah Coleman? What if I go as Sarah Bright Morning Coleman? What if I keep both names, both parts of who I am?" Running Wolf stared at her across the flickering fire. It was such a simple thing, adding a name. But in that simplicity lay a kind of revolution, the idea that a person could honor all the pieces of themselves instead of hiding the parts that didn't fit. "And what will you do in the white world?" he asked. "I'll learn to read and write better than I already do. I'll find work, maybe as a teacher or in one of the mission schools. And when people ask me about my dark eyes and my strange dreams and the songs I sometimes hum without thinking, I'll tell them about the Apache people who were brave and strong and loved their children enough to die for them." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the words were giving her courage. "I'll tell them about Bright Morning, who loved flowers and sang lullabies and fought like a warrior to protect what mattered. I'll tell them about Running Wolf, who saved a girl from an auction block because Apache people don't let children suffer when they have the power to stop it." Running Wolf felt tears on his cheeks and didn't try to hide them. In this moment, Sarah was more Apache than many who had been born, not because of her blood, but because of her heart, because of her understanding that the greatest strength sometimes lay in carrying forward what others would let die. Over the next 2 days, he taught her everything he could. He showed her how to make the morning prayers and how to read the wisdom written in cloud shapes. He sang her the lullabies that Bright Morning had sung, the ones that lived now only in Sarah's dreams and his memory. Most importantly, he told her the stories, not just the old ones about gods and heroes, but the real ones about their family, about the people whose blood ran in her veins. On the last morning, as the sun painted the eastern sky the color of ripe peaches, they prepared to part ways. Running Wolf had traded some of his remaining gold for supplies in a distant trading post, a sturdy horse for Sarah to ride, clothes that would help her blend into the white world, and enough money to see her safely to Santa Fe, where she might find work and a new beginning. "I want you to keep the necklace," he said as they stood together in the ruins of the old camp one last time. "But it belongs to the family. It should stay with you." "No," Running Wolf said, placing his hands on her shoulders. "It belongs to the future. Bright Morning would want you to have it, to carry it into whatever life you build. And someday, when you have daughters of your own, you can tell them where it came from." Sarah nodded, though tears spilled down her cheeks. She reached up and touched his face with gentle fingers. "Will I see you again? Perhaps. The desert is wide, but it's not infinite. If the spirits will it, our paths will cross again." They embraced then, uncle and niece, the last of their family. In that embrace, Running Wolf felt the ghost of his sister, felt her approval of the choice they were making together. Sometimes love meant holding on, and sometimes it meant letting go. This morning, it meant both. Sarah mounted her horse and looked back at him one last time. The morning light caught the turquoise beads at her throat and turned them into small suns. "What will you do now?" she asked. Running Wolf looked around the abandoned camp, at the stone circles and broken dreams, at the desert that stretched endlessly toward horizons that held no promises for men like him. "I'll keep fighting," he said. "Not with guns anymore, but with memory. I'll make sure the stories don't die with me. And I'll know that somewhere in the white world, there's an Apache girl named Sarah Bright Morning Coleman who carries our people's heart into tomorrow." Sarah smiled through her tears and touched her heels to her horse's sides. Running Wolf watched until she disappeared beyond the red mesas, carrying with her the seeds of a people who refused to let their spirit die, even when their world was ending. As the sun climbed higher and the desert began to shimmer with heat, Running Wolf began to gather his own things. There were other hidden camps to visit, other stories to preserve, other ways to fight for the memory of what had been and the hope of what might still be. Behind him, the wind stirred through the ruins, carrying the scent of sage and the echo of ancient songs. But ahead, beyond the mesas where Sarah had vanished, lay a different kind of future. One where being Apache didn't mean choosing between survival and identity, but finding the courage to be both. The path between worlds was a hard one to walk, but it was not impossible. And sometimes, Running Wolf thought, as he turned his face toward the endless sky, the hardest paths led to the most beautiful destinations.